You also heard a series of phrases by R.D. Laing, chanted over and over again, the famous closing phrases from his book, Politics of Experience, where he says, "If I could turn you on, if I could drive you out of your wretched mind, if I could tell you, I would let you know." The critic, David Scribner, described the 1968 performance of Paradise Now as psychic guerrilla warfare. He said that it was meant to, and I quote, "involve the audience so actively in the production itself that inhibitions, preconceptions, political ideas, and the structures of the ego dissolve." Those are heady words. Whatever the effect was on a given participant, because for some, it was the most amazing things they ever saw in their life. For others, it made them furious, and still others thought it was just bullshit. What's striking, I think, is the desire and the ambition, not only to go beyond representation, but to disarm the policeman in people's heads, whose institutional representative was the insane asylum. R.D. Laing, of course, was an anti-psychiatrist, at the heart of a movement which affected the entire Western world. Another break in the coercive order of the post-war period was clearly the release of madness into society, which in many countries literally meant opening the doors of the asylums, letting the inmates out onto the streets. We shouldn't forget the deep connections that a seemingly facile psychedelic culture had to all kinds of deliberate vanguard experiments with the borders and outer limits of normalcy, where the figure of the mad poet Artaud, interred himself during the war years in Rodez, was always somewhere just beneath the surface. What I think would be really interesting to explore, which I haven't actually explored yet in detail, is the degree to which the work of the living theater corresponds to Félix Guattari's ideas on how to form what he calls a collective agency of enunciation. That means how consciously did they try, the living theater group, to configure a singular world of experience so that the group affected by this experience could produce an original statement, so that it could find a voice and speak for itself. This would be subjection in reverse, the attempt to take over the workshop of the self, to reappropriate the production of subjectivity. The living theaters seem to be doing this in their preparatory work on the stage, and to some extent even with the public. More than just performing a transgression of morality or breaking down the fourth wall of representation, which is the classic vanguard thing to do, they seem to be looking beyond that for an intrinsic consistency, a collective self-creation. There's definitely a connection to the ground in the powerful sense of the existential territory, also a strong cosmological vision, which they developed into an esoteric code, as you can see in this chart, which they prepared for the performance of Paradise Now. And finally, all of that constituted an effective social assemblage, an erotic and energetic flow that raised the scandal all over the United States and Europe, provoking arrests, occupations, and social movements of all kinds. They were part of the famous occupation of the Odeon Theater in Paris in May '68, even a central part of it. So there seems to be a deep experimental interplay here between the four coordinates of Guattari's cartography: lyrical constellations of images, existential territories, energetic flows, and rhizomatic ideas. I think this would be something really to explore further, because I think it takes a group like that, or the conditions of an experimental institution like Laborde Clinic that Guattari worked in, or the conditions of, a wildcat. It takes a group, and in a situation where you can inject art and ideas into a existential reality, people's embodied, sexuated reality, but which is also movement. It takes all of that to configure a different world, which is also an experimental process. I must say I've done that in interesting situations in the streets in Europe around 10 years ago when we, time and again, also here in Canada, unleashed what we used to call the Carnival Against Capital. Very interesting existential thing where you change really the stars above your head and you start to feel a very different ground underneath your feet, and you learn a lot and you produce ideas and you're affected by ideas. These are situations that you can only have in the midst of social turmoil, situations that interest me a lot. And I think maybe the living theater is really kind of a strong version of that, so I think it would be quite interesting to look further into that. Now, finally, to reach more or less the end of this presentation, I'd like to look at just one more crack in the social order and the order of representation, which this time doesn't take place in the streets or on the stage, but in science. It begins in Santiago, at the University of Chile, in the experience of a biologist, Humberto Maturana, and of his student, who was soon to be his collaborator and maybe even his teacher, Francisco Varela. In the preface of the book Autopoiesis and Cognition, Maturana writes this. He says, "Early in May of 1968, the University of Chile entered a state of revolution. The students took over the university in an attempt to reformulate the philosophy that had inspired its organization. I joined them. All student academic activities stopped, and students and some members of the faculty tried to say something new. It was not easy. Language was a trap, but the whole experience was a wonderful school in which one could discuss how mute, deaf, and blind one was. It was easy to be caught in one's own ego, but if one succeeded in attaining at least some degree of freedom from it, one began to listen, and one's language began to change. And then, but only then, new things could be said. This lasted for several months." What came out of it for Maturana and Varela was an entirely new concept of biology, or in their language, of the realization of the living. Instead of looking at the component parts of a cell or of an animal or a human, subject to laws of causality in a mechanistic vision of the world, and instead of subordinating individual beings to the larger teleology of the evolution of the species, as in Darwinism, and indeed in social Darwinism as well, Maturana and Varela proposed that the living being is distinguished by its capacity to continually reproduce the integrity of its own organization, and thus to maintain the networks of its components over time. The living, they said, realizes itself by engaging in continuous self-creation, or in what they call autopoiesis. This activity of autopoiesis can take place at the level of the cell. There's someone trying to get in, I think.
No, I think somebody just stepped out.
This activity of autopoiesis can take place at the level of the cell, or it can take place at a higher power through the cellular cooperation that defines the integrity of an animal, or perhaps even at a third level in the cooperative relations that constitute a society. Maturana and Varela actually argued over this point. Maturana thought that autopoiesis could also be conceived of in the social realm. Varela, a more strict scientist, stuck to individual organisms as groups of cells and cells. But they both were concerned with this capacity of autopoiesis, which is the capacity to continue, of the living, to continue generating its own consistency, its own integrity, to continually reproduce itself for so long as it lives, that is, to maintain its network of relations